Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. An unusual pleasure for a lawyer to attend a conference of actuaries. It might surprise you to learn that I'm actually an advocate of no-fault compensation, but no-fault compensation that fully compensates all accident victims for all of their losses. As we all know, no such scheme exists anywhere in the world because such a scheme would be completely unaffordable. So what we're faced with in terms of designing schemes is to come up with a scheme where we know that at the outset there are limited resources. We know that there are going to be X number of people that require those resources, and so we have to come up with some sort of a design that will deliver compensation to those people in need. And there are three ways that we can go about this, it seems to me. One is to opt for a pure no-fault model, such as we have in the Northern Territory or New Zealand. And I might say that I'm talking about CTP insurance schemes here, not workers' compensation. So the first model is the pure no-fault Northern Territory, New Zealand. And basically under that model, no one gets full cover, no one gets all of their losses paid, everybody gets less than they need. The second is to have a fault-based scheme, such as we have in most of the states of Australia, Queensland, WA, SA, ACT, New South Wales, by and large, where it's fault-based, and that means that people who can prove fault will recover X amount of compensation, be more than they'd get under a no-fault scheme, but of course we have a community cost of a large number of people who are at fault who get nothing at all. The third alternative is a hybrid scheme, such as we have in Victoria with the Transport Accident Commission and Tasmania. And under those schemes, no-fault compensation is paid to everybody who's eligible, and certain people can bring common law claims for damages. A fair distribution of resources has got to be the fundamental goal of every compensation scheme. Fairness, in my view, is pivotal to community acceptance of any scheme. The concept of fault resonates in the community. It certainly resonates in the accident victim community, which after all is a microcosm of the broader community. Every day in my practice, I have people coming to see me, and the one thing that I hear over and over again is, this accident wasn't my fault. Look how my life has changed. It was interesting to hear Norman Swan talk about control. The one thing that characterises just about any sort of trauma is the immediate loss of control that the accident victim feels. So their lives are turned upside down. These compensation schemes, and they're all said and done, are about people. People who've never been involved in an accident can sit back and talk about how these schemes should work. People who have been involved in accidents have a completely different perspective about it. This notion of fault resonates in the community, and I think it's a very, very important factor that's got to be taken into account. Now, of course, you'd expect me to say that I'm a lawyer, I make money out of running common law claims, and that's true. But every day I see accident victims, and they all say the same thing about fault. Now, I want to tell you something about the TAC scheme, because I'm an advocate for the TAC system. I think the design of that scheme is first rate. I don't think there's anything that comes near it in Australia or overseas that I've ever seen. So you need to know something a little bit about the benefits that are available. On the no-fault side of things, everyone has medical cover. The medical cover is exceptional. Claimants under the scheme have got the same status as privately insured individuals, private health insurance. They have private hospitals, they have choice of doctors, everything's covered medically. And that includes things that you may not expect to be covered, such as home modifications for catastrophically injured people, motor vehicle modifications fully funded, contributions towards the cost of purchasing a motor vehicle to be modified. You have attendant care for life. All of the medical cover is lifelong for everybody. It is an exceptional no-fault scheme in that regard. The vast majority of accident victims under the TAC system will get 3 years of income support if they need it. 80% of their pre-accident average weekly earnings. And for a small group of accident victims on a no-fault basis whose impairment is determined at 50% or more, they will get that particular coverage through to age 65, indexed annually. On the no-fault side, people also have an entitlement potentially to receive a lump sum payment called an impairment benefit. The AMA Guides, 4th edition, is used to determine that entitlement. The threshold entry point for the impairment benefit is 11% whole person impairment, which attracts a payment of about $7,500. 100% impairment's about $330,000. So a person with quadriplegia or paraplegia could reasonably expect to receive a no-fault lump sum payment of between $200,000 and $300,000 in addition to the income support and the lifetime medical cover. It's an extraordinary scheme, particularly for the severely injured. If one looked at it purely as a no-fault scheme and then looked at the premium that we pay in Victoria, which is I think the 5th cheapest premium CTP in Australia, it is remarkable value for money. But we also have a common law right. And the common law right is restricted only to those people with serious injuries. And a serious injury is determined by reference to 2 things. One is a 30% impairment under the AMA Guides. For those people with less than a 30% impairment, there's a narrative, or there are 4 narrative definitions of serious injury. That probably scares a lot of actuaries, I'd imagine, the idea of having a narrative test, but it's proved to be quite successful in Victoria. The common law scheme delivers for those who can prove fault pain and suffering damages up to a statutory maximum of $518,000 and pecuniary loss damages, that is, damages for loss of income and impaired earning capacity, up to a maximum of about $1.16 million. Everybody keeps the medical cover for life, even those people who bring common law claims. So it's, in my view, a very, very good scheme. I could spend half an hour telling you about its problems, but if you take a step back from that and look at the scheme as an overall scheme, I think it is a remarkable scheme. One of the things that we hear about is financial sustainability. This scheme came into operation on the 1st of January 1987, so it's approaching its 28th birthday. The scheme has been financially successful. It is robust financially, it's well managed, and there's nothing on the horizon that I know of that would indicate that the scheme is under any type of threat. What is truly remarkable about this scheme, though, is the history of it. If you go back to 1986, this scheme replaced a scheme which was also a hybrid scheme that had unfunded liabilities of $1.5 billion, which doesn't sound all that much these days, but I can tell you in 1986 it scared a lot of people. The scheme came into operation on the 1st of January 87. The first bill that came before the Victorian Parliament abolished common law rights, and the first iteration of this scheme was a pure no-fault scheme. It was through political intervention by the Liberal and National Party opposition that this common law right was built into the scheme. The scheme started off as a non-profit making scheme, which is really where it starts getting interesting, I think, because the scheme made a huge amount of money in its first 4 or 5 years of operation because it was starting from scratch. In 1992, a large amount of money had accumulated in the Transport Accident Fund, so much so that our then Premier, Joan Kerner, who was leading a financially strapped government at the time, introduced a bill into the Victorian Parliament to corporatise the TAC. The opposition at that stage, the Liberal Party, came out against the bill. And I've got etched into my brain the vision of Alan Stockdale, the Shadow Treasurer, standing there and saying, this money in the Transport Accident Fund is held on trust by the TAC for injured Victorian motorists. The first thing that the Kennett government did in 1992 when they won the election was to pass Joan Kirner's bill. So the TAC became corporatised. The first amount of money that was taken out of the Transport Accident Fund was $1.5 billion. Successive governments have taken money out of the fund every year. The fund pays, or the TAC pays, a dividend of 50% of its profit every year to the government, and the government takes capital distributions at different times. In terms of sustainability, I did an exercise in about 2000, 2001 by getting all of the annual reports of the TAC. In fact, this will appeal to you guys as actuaries, I'd imagine. I got all of the annual reports. I worked out the precise amounts that have been taken out of the fund between 92 and about 2000. I put the money back in, applied the rate of return on the fund as published in the annual reports, compounded it, and what I discovered was that the income that would have been generated from the money that was taken out of the fund would have been enough for that scheme to be self-funding. In other words, there would have been no change in the level of benefits paid to accident victims, but the government, if it had wanted to go down this path, could have delivered free CTP insurance for Victorian motorists, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. But what that represented in 1992 was a paradigm shift in terms of how the scheme had to be managed. And of course, that's where all of the efforts have been ever since, is to how to manage the scheme so that it will remain sustainable. And the importance of sustainability really can't be overemphasised, because there are a very large number of severely injured people who are reliant on that scheme to provide attendant care support, all of those benefits that I described. And so financial viability is fundamental to not just the scheme, but all of those people that make up the scheme, the accident victim community, and not just past, but also in the future. The one thing that I look at with the TAC scheme when I compare it to schemes, CTP schemes around the country, is this. I say to myself, why do we spend so much time trying to design schemes around this country when we have a template in Victoria with the TAC scheme that works? It's worked for almost 28 years. It is financially viable, and it has broad acceptance in the Victorian community. I might complain about too many red light cameras and speed cameras and sort of road law enforcement measures, but that's part of the TAC strategy under the legislation, is road safety has to be addressed. In other words, injury prevention, and that has been incredibly successful. So what I'd say to you people who are involved in scheme design is, why don't you look at the TAC model and use that as a template? If we had, instead of having a federal system, if we had one big system, I think the TAC would be a great model. Thank you very much.